All right, welcome to part 2 of day 2. So these are notes on inequalities in two triangles. So let's go ahead and get started. So we have first here this theorem that says if two sides of one triangle are congruent to two sides of another triangle, and the included angle of the first is larger than the included angle of the second, then the third side of the first is longer than the third side of the second. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at these two pictures that I have down here, you'll notice that these two sides of this triangle are going to be congruent to these two sides of this triangle. So these here, we've got this side here congruent to this side here, and these two sides are also going to be congruent. The thing that's not the same about them is between these two sides is this angle, and in this triangle it's 85 degrees, and over here on this triangle it's 95 degrees. So we know that the third side is not going to be the same because by side angle side congruence, we know if these two angles were the same, then the triangles would be congruent. The whole point is these two angles are not the same. And the side angle side inequality theorem basically says, well, if this angle in between here are different sizes, then they're not congruent. And the smaller angle is going to be opposite the smaller side. And the bigger angle is going to be opposite the bigger side. So this section is about comparing two different triangles. Now, again, the two sides are congruent, but the angles are not, so then the third sides are not. And then the bigger side is going to go with the bigger angle. I have a couple of practice problems below. So number one, example 1 over here, we have two triangles. So I have one over here, triangle MNP, and the one on the bottom here, triangle MPO. And they are two triangles. It looks like they have one pair of sides that are congruent. So MN is going to be congruent to MO over here. And also because of the reflexive property, they share a side, so that side is going to be congruent. So I have this triangle and this triangle with two pairs of sides that are congruent. The included angles are not congruent, so that means these third sides are not going to be congruent. Again, we need to look at the angles to figure out which one's going to be bigger. So we have OP here, and we have NP over here. So the angle that's 43 degrees, that's going to be opposite this one over here, NP. And 47 degrees is going to be opposite this one over here, OP. So since 47 degrees is the bigger angle, that one's going to be opposite the larger side. 43 degrees is a smaller angle, so that's going to be opposite the smaller side. So here, because the angles are not congruent, these two sides are not going to be congruent. And because 47 degrees is the bigger angle, it's going to be opposite the bigger side. So we need to fill in the blank here. Remember, the alligator eats the bigger number, and we know that OP is going to be the larger number in this case. So OP is greater than NP. The distance between O and P is going to be greater than the distance between N and P. Example number 2, over on this side, we have again two triangles, triangle KJL and triangle TRS over here. And again, we have a pair of sides that are congruent. So this side over here, JK, is congruent to this side over here, RT. And we have JL over here on this side is going to be congruent to RS over here on this side. The included angles are not congruent. That means the third sides are not going to be congruent. 25 degrees is opposite KL, and 26 degrees is opposite ST. So since they are not the same size, they are not going to be congruent. So this is not going to be an equal sign. The bigger side is going to be opposite the bigger angle. Since 26 degrees is the bigger angle, ST, that's going to be the longer side. So alligator eats the bigger number. We're going to put in a less than here. So ST is going to be the larger side, so that one, it's going to go this way, less than. Another couple quick examples. Example number 3, it says if line segment GM is congruent to line segment GE. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those. So line segment GM is going to be congruent to line segment GE. And the measure of angle 1 is greater than the measure of angle 2. Then we have to come up with some conclusion. Well, we have two separate triangles here, the triangle GMO and the triangle GEO over down here. We have one pair of sides that are congruent, and then once again, because they share a side, because of the reflexive property, I know that line segment GO is congruent to line segment GO. So these two sides in this triangle are congruent to these two sides in this triangle. And we know that the angles, the included angles, are not congruent. Again, because the measure of angle M is greater than the measure of angle 2, or sorry, the measure of angle 1 is greater than the measure of angle 2, then I know the one that 1 is opposite is going to be bigger than the side that 2 is opposite. So because the measure of angle 1 is greater than the measure of angle 2, I know the distance between M and O must be greater than the distance between O and E. So that's going to be my conclusion. The distance between M and O is going to be greater than the distance between O and E. And the reason is the theorem that we learned above. Your textbook calls it the side angle side inequality theorem, but most people just call this the hinge theorem, and that's okay with me. So that's the hinge theorem, which is the theorem you guys had up above. One more of these. So if line segment AD is congruent to line segment BC, so here is line segment AD, and I'm saying this is congruent to line segment BC, which is this one over here. And it says the measure of angle DAC, so that's this angle, is 31 degrees. And the measure of angle ACB, so ACB, that's this angle here, is 32 degrees. Then I need to come up with a conclusion. Well, I have a pair of sides that are congruent. Also, AC is congruent to AC by the reflexive property. So I have two sides in this triangle that are congruent and two sides in this triangle that are congruent. The included angles are not congruent. So here I have 31 degrees, that's opposite line segment CD. 32 degrees is opposite AB. Since 31 degrees is smaller than 32 degrees, the distance between C and D is going to be smaller than the distance between A and B. Again, you need to look at the side that's opposite the angle. And remember, the side that's opposite the angle is the side that the angle is not touching. It's going to be the one that's on the other side from it. So 31 degrees goes with CD, 32 degrees goes with AB, and since 31 degrees is a smaller number, line segment CD is going to be the smaller segment. And once again, the reason is going to be the hinge theorem. All right, we're halfway there. So let's go ahead and go over to the next page, page 15. So like a lot of other theorems, this also has a converse that is true. So the converse of the hinge theorem says, if two sides of a triangle are congruent to two sides of another triangle, and the third side is longer than the third side, then the included angle is larger than the included angle. So before we said if two sides are congruent and the angles aren't, then you can figure out about the length of the sides. Here we have if two sides are congruent, but the third sides aren't, you can make a conclusion about the angles. So here again I have these two angles are congruent to these two angles, these two sides are congruent to these two sides. The third sides are not. This one, it says the length is 11.2, and GI over here has a length of 10.6. So since the third sides are not congruent, the triangles are not congruent, which means these angles cannot be the same. So since 11.2 is the bigger side, it must be opposite the bigger angle. Since 10.6 is the smaller side, it's going to be opposite the smaller angle. So here's a few practice problems that we're going to walk through together, and then I'll let you guys have a chance to practice on your own. So in this one here, it says given line segment PR is congruent to line segment XY. So line segment PR is going to be congruent to line segment XY, and line segment QR is going to be congruent to line segment ZY. So here is QR, and that's congruent to line segment ZY. And I know that the distance between P and Q is greater than the distance between X and Z. Now PQ is labeled 9 here. XZ doesn't have a label, but it doesn't really matter because I just know that it's going to be smaller than 9. So since these third sides are not congruent, that means these angles cannot be congruent. So since the distance between P and Q is bigger than the distance between X and Z, that means that the angle that it's opposite, so here it's angle R, and the angle this one's opposite, angle Y, these angles must also be different. Since 9 is bigger, since PQ is bigger than XZ, that means the measure of angle R must be bigger than the measure of angle Y. So that's going to be our conclusion, and this time our reason is the converse of the hinge theorem. To be honest, whether it's the hinge theorem or the converse of the hinge theorem is not one that's particularly important for this unit. What's more important is that you can figure out, okay, which one is going to be larger, which angle is larger, which side is going to be larger. Here is one more. So in this one, I have a couple of pictures here, and I am given these angles. So this time I have these two line segments over here, line segment PQ and line segment QR, that are congruent to these two line segments in this triangle, which are XZ and ZY. The angles between them are not congruent. So since they're not congruent, these third sides are not going to be congruent. 41 degrees is smaller than 43 degrees, so I can make a conclusion about the sides that they're opposite. So 41 degrees is opposite PR, and 43 degrees is opposite XY. Since 41 degrees is smaller than 43 degrees, that means the distance between P and R must be smaller than the distance between X and Y. So that's going to be my conclusion. And this one is the hinge theorem, since I know the angles. Again, I'm not really that concerned about the reason. I'm more concerned with, can you come up with a correct conclusion? Just two left. And this one's going to involve a little bit of algebra. So here I have two triangles. I know that this line segment here on the top is congruent to this line segment here on the bottom. So these two line segments are congruent. By the reflexive property, this shared side is going to be congruent to itself. So I have two sides in this triangle that are congruent to two sides in this triangle. The angles are not the same size. Because the angles are not the same size, x plus 5 and 8 can't be the same number. 28 is the larger number, so that means x plus 5 must be greater than 8. So I'm going to write an inequality. X plus 5 is greater than 8. That means it's going to be pretty simple to go ahead and solve that inequality. So x plus 5 is greater than 8. I can subtract 5 from both sides, and I can conclude that x is going to be greater than 3. So my conclusion over here is going to be that x is greater than 3. And yeah, we're going to kind of ignore the reasons for now. It's the hinge theorem because you knew the angles and you made a conclusion about the sides. One last one. So this one, we just gave you some numbers and variables. So I have a triangle here on the top and a triangle here on the bottom. I know at least I have one pair of sides that are the same. This one here that says 6, that line segment must be congruent to this one on the bottom here, which is also going to be 6. So I have a pair of line segments that are congruent. These two triangles also share a side, so by the reflexive property, that side's going to be congruent to itself. Now I know that the third sides are not congruent. Here it says this length is 10 and this length is 9. So since these third sides are not congruent, that means that the angles that they are opposite must also not be congruent. So looking over here, we've got a 2x plus 5 and a 25 degrees. Again, they can't be the same because 9 and 10 are not the same. 10 is going to be the larger number. That must mean that 2x plus 5 is larger than 25. So 2x plus 5 is greater than 25. That's going to be pretty easy to solve as well. I can subtract 5 from both sides and divide both sides by 2. And I'm going to find that x must be larger than 10. So my conclusion is going to be that x is greater than 10. And that's all the examples that I have. So now is a really good time to pause the video. Go ahead and flip over to the back page. It's the end of the packet, so we are done with notes for this chapter. So again, flip over to the next page and pause the video. Go ahead and try those two problems by yourself, and I'll see you when you get back. Hopefully you have had a chance to try these two on your own. So for number 1, you had two sides that were congruent to two sides, and the third sides were congruent. So if the third sides are congruent, then the angles that it's opposite must also be congruent, because honestly, if all three sides are congruent to all three sides, the triangles are congruent. So that must mean that the measure of angle C and the measure of angle Z are the same. So I hope you put an equal sign in there. For example number 2, I have a pair of line segments that are congruent, so GK and JK are going to be congruent, and I have a shared side, KH, that is congruent, so I have two sides that are congruent to two sides. The third sides are not congruent. This one says 3.5, and this one over here says 3.55. I mean, pretty obviously these pictures are not drawn to scale. That must mean that the angles that they're opposite are not going to be equal. So 3.5 is smaller than 3.55. So angle GKH must be smaller than angle JKH. So you should have put in a less than symbol there. Okay, I hope you did pretty well on this. You should have enough now to go ahead and be able to do the homework. There's a few on there that are kind of tricky, but remember to check your answers on Blackboard, and if it doesn't give you a hint, then remember those, and we'll go over those in class the next time I see you guys. The next time I see you guys, we'll be going over the homework assignment. That's homework number 3, and we're going to go ahead and take our quiz for Unit 5, because that's pretty much all there is. If you can do everything on all 3 homework assignments, or even most of the things on the 3, and you understand all the examples and the notes, you should be in really good shape for the quiz. So take care, guys, and I hope to see you soon.